We are delighted to welcome back into these parts Patrick Martin, Middle East correspondent for the Globe and Mail, and a guy who spent a lot of time in this studio in a couple of different incarnations. So it's really great to have you back here again.
Well, it's great to be back, Steve. Thanks for
having me. You've
having
been overseas for a long time, and we've missed you. Let me put it that way.
Thanks.
You've done this really quite amazing series, Inside Hamas, both for the newspaper and for the website. And let's just show people a snippet of what's online right now, and then we'll come back and talk, okay? Roll tape, please, Michael.
If there's ever to be peace between Palestinians and Israelis, Israel and countries like Canada may have to do the unthinkable and one day talk to Hamas, the Middle East organization that's been left out of peace negotiations. A lot of people won't have anything to do with them because of their past terrorist activities or because they reject the right of Israel to exist. But who are the people behind the mask of Hamas? What do they stand for? Do they still support the violence that included suicide bombing that shook Israel and rocked the world? Or in fact, do they accept a two-state solution? Do they still want to push the Jews into the sea?
Okay, first and foremost, what did you think was important for people to understand about Hamas?
I think they needed to be identified as people. For all of their extreme views and various views, I think most people think of them in a very stereotypical way. They see a mask, they see the fighter, the suicide bomber, and that's an image that they retain. I think that it's important for people as we go forward in the Middle East peace negotiations or in whatever happens in the Middle East, that people understand just who these guys are. And maybe they will then have a rational reason for considering talking to them or deciding not to talk to them. I think people are ill-informed at the moment, or at least they were before this series came out.
Okay, let's go back and check a little bit of the history. Hamas really introduced suicide bombing into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Yeah.
Why did they go that route?
Well, it's interesting because they had, in the early stages of the Intifada, 1987, 1988, when Hamas was founded, and the young men out in the streets were partly from the PLO and partly from Hamas, they encouraged them only to throw stones. No real serious violence, no real serious arms being used against them. That would morph into small arms fire and various things, but they limited all their attacks to inside the occupied territories. They were very scrupulous about this. I was based there in the early 90s and was there for much of this, and when Yitzhak Rabin saw the effectiveness of this organization, he rounded up 415 of the leaders and shipped them out of the country up into Lebanon in the north. Why? They hadn't carried out a single attack inside Israel at that point. This is 1992. What they had done was effectively attack the Israeli military bases and sometimes some settlers in the West Bank and Gaza. But that was the limit, and it was very effective. When those guys came back a year later and they began again this campaign, an incident happened which triggered their desire to strike hard at the heart of Israel. And that was the Brook Goldstein massacre in Hebron. That was in February 1994.
You should just remind me, an Israeli citizen.
Israeli settler, a doctor in reserve duty in the army, went into a mosque in Hebron, which is also where there's a synagogue and where there's the original churches. I mean, it's a place of all three religions. He went into the mosque side of things and killed 29 people who were at prayer. The reaction to that, I mean, I went down to Hebron that day. I had to go through the countryside to get there, and I interviewed people coming out. The horror, the contempt for this was remarkable, and they decided, and they say in our documentaries, a number of them will indicate that that was the moment when they decided they had to strike right at the civilians inside Israel.
But you also say in the doc that in the year 2005 they stopped with suicide bombings.
Yeah.
How come?
Well, the reality is that they had learned that they were losing more than they were gaining. Perhaps they were effective in the early days in frightening the Israelis. And the Israelis were revolted by what they were doing in the second Intifada in the early 2000s. But the world was revolted by Hamas, and they realized that they were losing so much, they had to make a change. There was a new leader, too, who came in, Khalid Michel, and he's the one who ordered the stop so that they could begin to demonstrate they were a credible organization, ultimately go to an election, which they would win. Mm-hmm. But they knew that their standing internationally would be hopeless unless they got rid of it.
I'll pick up the story there. 2006, they decided to participate in those elections. Yeah. They did very well in those elections, and I wonder how being involved in the political process has now changed Hamas.
Well, they now have the responsibility of government, at least in Gaza. They were elected, as you know, to be the government of all of Palestinian territories, West Bank and Gaza. And they formed the government with a prime minister named Haniyeh, but they would separate and split from the PLO over a number of issues, and they ultimately had a fight in Gaza. They kept Gaza and the PLO kept the West Bank, these two. Since then, that was in June of 2007, they have governed that place, and they've realized the frustration of government trying to keep a place together. There's efforts within their movement to really Islamize the place, make sure women are all covered, make sure nobody has fun on the beach, make sure there's no women smoking nargile on the streets. All these things that they've passed laws of, many of them they've rescinded ultimately because of the public reaction. So they're realizing, hey, government ain't so easy. And in fact, so they're having to deal with all of that.
Have they,
had to
fact,
fight a
delivered...
terrible war also against Israel, and they had took a huge beating in December 2008 to January 2009.
Do you think they've actually made good on their pledge to improve the lives of the Palestinians who live in the area of their responsibility?
To the best of their ability, I think they have. You know, in Gaza, as you know, all of the borders are closed, the sea is blockaded, and so material coming into the Gaza Strip was restricted to relief supplies coming through UNRWA that the Israelis were allowing all to pass through, and the tunnels which people dug into Egyptian territory in the Sinai, and they would smuggle goods in.
Just we don't deal with acronyms here. UNRWA, the United Nations.
I'm sorry, the United Nations Refugee Works Agency.
Agency, okay.
And the UNRWA was this organization in Gaza is the people internationally involved in providing relief to the people in terms of schools and hospitals and whatnot. And they did bring in supplies. And the Israelis, since the flotilla of a year ago, have opened the doors much more and allowing a lot more things. So to the best of their ability, Hamas was providing for people. And I went down, I remember in December of 2008, after I went back, to see, I had stories of people starving. They weren't starving at all. In fact, it was misleading because the markets were full of fresh fruit and various products that they were growing, would normally have exported to Israel or somewhere else. They couldn't get them out, so they all had a lot of strawberries to eat for a while, or a lot of tomatoes, or whatever it might be. They weren't starving, the tunnels were feeding them too. As a result, these guys have had an opportunity to sort of show reasonable government. I have to say, though, that they have failed to win the affection of the people still to this day. It's estimated, and there are some surveys, but I can't say how reliable they are, that as few as 20% of the people now support them in Gaza. In the West Bank, quite a higher percentage support them in the West Bank. They admire their stick-to-itiveness and their desire to, be tough with Israel. But in Gaza, I think you blame a government when you live as rough a life as they are, and they're getting a lot of the blame.
You've had a front row on the most amazing story of the last X number of years, the Arab Spring, so-called. You're in Cairo for that. You've been in Yemen. How do you think the Arab Spring has affected Hamas's situation?
I think what happened is twofold. First of all, the Palestinian people wanted to be part of this uprising too, because they know that whether in the West Bank or Gaza, their life has not been full, has not been as successful, has not been as animated, as they have not had the opportunities that they would like in a normal life to have. And they know that the peace process is grinding along very slowly. So you have seen an activation of the people in Gaza and in the West Bank. The trouble is they don't know where to go. Partly they want to blame Hamas. They know if they go too far, they'll probably get their heads cut off. They don't want to do that. What they do want to do is send a message that we want improvements here too. The address to which they should be delivering it, they're being told by Palestinian leaders in both places, is Israel. They're the ones responsible still for it. And that's what they've been demonstrating in the streets, that we want this process to go forward. We want Israel to be brought to account. We want this situation to change. So you have a people there that are activated. In a way, Hamas has suffered less than Abu Mazen has, the leader of the West Bank Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas has tried very hard to join in the peace process under certain terms that he has set. He doesn't want to join the peace process until settlement stops, for example. But what he does, try to show is the development of the West Bank. And I have to say they've done remarkably well in the West Bank, especially through his Prime Minister Salam Fayyad. Fabulous economic growth in that area. I mean, really, a quality of living in the urban centers in particular that is really better than they've ever had before under the British, under the Jordanians, under anybody. So I've written about that, and that's important. But what he's now suffering the blame for is this uprising of the people who want something to come to pass. And it was responsible, I believe, for the reconciliation between the two sides. When in the beginning of May in Cairo, the leaders of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas and of Hamas, Khalid Michel, met, and they signed an agreement to say, we will now work to reconcile our two organizations, bring them together.
Great photo op.
It's a big deal, absolutely.
It hasn't happened yet.
They keep postponing the discussions and the pronouncement of the government that will run jointly. But what it was, I think, is a reflection of that need to respond to the people in the streets. And that move alone has raised the popularity of both movements in Gaza and West Bank.
Let's talk about Israel. Part of Hamas's 1988 covenant states, not only must Israel not be recognized, it must be obliterated.
That's the word.
What did Hamas officials tell you about that part of their constitution?
We spoke to many Hamas people. We spoke to over 30 of them, and there are 16 of the interviews in the documentary package, in the package we did. Most of those with whom we discussed that particular point would say, of course, that's our goal, and that's what we're going to stick to. Many of them would say that's our long-term goal. We have short-term offers that we're willing to make, a hudna, some sort of short-term armistice that we would have. Never a recognition of Israel, but at least a willingness to live side by side for some X number of years in which we'll see where things go.
What's the X?
10 to 20 is the most popular.
Okay.
Some would say 10, some will say 20.
So we'll
and
put the
somewhere in there.
obliteration on hold for 10 or 20 years.
Exactly. But it's not to say we'll cancel it entirely. So that's what many of them would say. Some would say, we're never going to rest until we obliterate it, period. Others would say, we'll have a short-term armistice. And finally, you have some, like Aziz Dweik, whom I quote in the analysis piece. Aziz Dweik is the political leader of the West Bank, of Hamas on the West Bank, excuse me. He's from Hebron. Quite a pragmatic, moderate fellow. I got to know in 1991. I visited him in exile in Lebanon along with the other 414 guys. He was one of the 2 leaders up there at the camp. So he's a man well-connected, admired. And I put this to him. I said, you're never going to get anywhere with these guys with this thing. He said, Patrick, that is not the Holy Quran. This is a political document that was written by some people in a hurry in early 1988. This is not the Holy Quran. It can be adapted. That was his verdict. Now, others have confirmed that. Ahmed Yusuf says the same thing. You know, this is something we can work around.
How
Don't get
prevalent
too.
would you say that view is, though?
It's a minority view in the movement, but they happen to be held by some very influential guys in the movement. And I think the key will be how Khalid Mashal views something like that. Every indication is that the leader based in Damascus, Khalid Mashal, who grew up in a village, Silwad, just north of Ramallah, that this man of all the leaders they've ever had is the least radical and the most determined to make a difference. And I think maybe it's because he's starved out there sitting in Damascus as opposed to being in the Holy Land, being in Palestine somewhere. But whatever the motive is for him, he seems to be dedicated to making this change. And he's the one in Cairo, May the 4th, I think it was, who said, I am willing to accept a Palestinian state defined by the 1967 lines in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, he had said that before in some interviews, but it's such a public pronouncement he had not made, and that made a lot of people stand up and take notice.
I wonder whether you feel your series has helped to create an image of Hamas that is not as unidimensional as perhaps the Western press traditionally does. Are these guys, in fact, the monsters that they are often portrayed to be?
Some of them are. No question about it. And we've spoken to some that are. You've heard one bomber in the series, Mansour, said that he went to jail for 25 years for planting a bomb at the Tel Aviv bus station. It badly injured a sapper who was disarming it. I asked him, do you regret that it didn't have greater damage, that it didn't kill more? And he sort of pulls back and said, yeah, I wish it had. And I asked him later in the interview, if you look at the complete interview with this man, Mohammed Mansour, he says, most ominously, I think, of just about all of them, there's one other fellow, he predicts a future that is going to be very bloody. And he believes that Hamas will be at the forefront of the victors in this in the
If
conflict.
you check the calendar, it's kind of like every 2.5 years they go at it, don't
Something,
they?
yeah. So, this series was never meant to whitewash Hamas, and it doesn't do that, I believe. It exposes where there's extremist views, where there's moderate views, where there's different views. And I think it's important that we know the layers that are in an organization like this before we unidimensionally describe them. Mashal was the new guy. He followed 2 very radical leaders, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdelaziz Rantisi. They were both firebrands, if you like. Mashal is a different kind of guy. He got out of the suicide bombing business. He's not renouncing violence. He believes there's a place for the violent uprising, although he doesn't want it to be in the form of suicide bombings, because it will indicate to the community that they're serious. It wins their support, and it indicates to Israel that they're serious.
But there's no Anwar Sadat about to make a trip to Jerusalem and say, come on, let's get this done.
There probably isn't, but he's as close as that you might actually get to it. I mean, he went to Cairo and said that, and that was a journey that he had to make. I mean, there are many. I don't believe Rantisi or Ahmed Yassin would have made that journey to Cairo and made that statement.
In our last couple of minutes, I want to ask you the simplest question, but will no doubt be the most difficult to answer.
Oh boy.
So take a swig of water, because here we go. Is Hamas a terrorist organization?
Yeah. It's an organization that's practiced terror, and as a result, we would have to say they're a terrorist organization. They practice terror in the form of suicide bombings and other things in which civilians were targets inside civilian territory. And I think that any time you do that, yeah, you are branded as terrorist. Now, they stopped that in 2005, but then they launched the rockets into southern Israel. They didn't kill or injure that many people, but they did terrorize an awful lot of people. And yes, because of that, they're a terrorist organization. However, they are multi-layered, as we try to show. And so if you can pry them away from their practices, you might find there's still a substantial amount that represents the desires of the Palestinian people that they represent, that can be worked with, that can be talked to, that can be described in something other than a terrorist organization. But I don't want to shy from the fact they have used it. First of all, they used it to their advantage, just like the PLO did. You know, we must forget that in the 1970s, when I was coming of age in these subjects, the PLO were the ones carrying out airplane hijackings and the Entebbe raid and various things in which they launched terrorist tactics against the people in the West. Hamas has never taken its fight outside what they would describe as Greater Palestine. The targets have been, first of all, West Bank and Gaza, and then inside Israel. Never beyond that. And they swear they will never do that. So they're a different kind of organization in that sense. And as the parties to the peace agreement with the Palestinians realized, we can forget that past if you're willing to renounce it and proceed. These guys need to renounce violence. That's what they need to do. More than recognize Israel, I would argue, more than accept the agreements of the past, they need to renounce violence, and then they could actually talk.
The leader of the PLO ended up in the Rose Garden at the White House one day.
Yeah.
You think that's possible here too?
It's conceivable.
It is,
It's
eh?
conceivable, but they still have a ways to go. At this moment, they're playing hard to get. And I think that they believe as long as they stop the rockets, and as long as they don't resort to anything like suicide bombing or anything like that again, and they didn't during that war when Israel attacked them in 08-09, I kept waiting for it. And I asked the Hamas guys, when are you going to bring out the super weapon you've got that you've used so well in the past, or you've used so effectively in the past? And they said, we're not going to do it. We're serious. And they were. That was, in fact, when I first had the seed, we've got to get into these guys and find out more about them, because that was a total surprise to me.
Thanks to you, we know a lot more about them now. Thanks a lot for the series and for coming in today to tell us all about it, Patrick. Great to see you again.
Nice to see you, Steve.